Dan, thank you so much for coming on.
No, man, I appreciate the invitation, Alex. Thank you so much.
Where do you want to go first? There's so much to get into.
Well, first, I just want to say that I've listened to you for years and that you do more good for the American people in your one show than all the rest of the media combined. I know you don't like people just, praising you like that, but it's true. I listened to you for years. Long story short, I got into radio in 2007. Great extent because of your show and what I had heard. A friend of mine is the chief economist of the Federal Reserve. He and I would have lunch, argue back and forth. I was so right. He finally got so upset with me. He said, "I'm going to find a station to put you on," and the rest was history. And my specialty was always economics and what's going on in the world. So that's kind of how I have, but I have it all because of you.
Well, Dan, please don't talk about me anymore. I'm just glad that you and so many other people have been spurred because of this broadcast to start your own radio shows. Because I know you've gotten pretty good ratings up there in Dallas, been on several different stations, and we salute you for that work you're doing covering these issues. Where do you want to go first? Because obviously, the economy's not as good as they're claiming. What is your view on the state of the U.S. and world economy in general?
Well, here's where I start out, and it's the fact that people talk about how the economy is recovering. They talk about all these wonderful numbers, employment numbers, and everything. It's rosy, and none of it's rosy. I believe you cannot possibly have a good analysis if you're working off of bad facts. We're intentionally being fed bad facts by the Federal Reserve, the BEA, the BLS, all the people that give us these key numbers. These numbers aren't anything of what they look like. The inflation numbers, it's impossible to assume there's a 1.5–2% inflation number. I know you and I share a friend in John Williams at Shadow Stats, and his numbers are spot on. So what you've got is you've got people in the investment world making decisions, and they're developing their whole narrative off of horrible financial numbers. I'll give you one in particular, Alex. I know you were joking about this before the show. Something called the Baltic Dry Index. It's such an obscure thing, but it's so meaningful to the whole world. It measures how many goods are being shipped back and forth between countries around the world. It has never been, this is almost 40 years this index has been around. It's never, ever been lower. That means never has there been less product moving around the world than there is right now. That's a horrifying number, but you don't see it anymore.
Is that why the Chinese are selling steel at cheaper than it is to produce?
Yeah, and also another good indication is when you look at China and the amount of electricity usage that they're using. That's a very good indication of how strong an economy is, and their usage of electricity has been steadily declining, not growing. You can't have that in a growing economy.
So what is the real state of the economy globally then, in your view?
All right, you touched on derivatives, and I think the next conflict in this world, even though it looks horrible in Ukraine, nuclear weapons, maybe not, it's the financial world where the next major conflict will occur. We talk about derivatives. There's somewhere between 1 and 2 quad, which is you know what that is? It's 1,000 trillion in derivatives out there. 25 trillion roughly linked to the euro. 25 trillion roughly are linked to oil and gas. If you have oil dropping to $20 a barrel, you will effectively make roughly $25 trillion worth of derivatives. Whereas if Greece repudiates that and the EU will have effectively made the euro enough so those derivatives become worthless. Well, either one of 25 trillion, and that roughly represents 1/3 of the total GDP. Well, imagine, Alex, if you make $100,000 a year, and that's your income, that's GDP. So now imagine that all of a sudden, $20,000, let's say, what would that be? $20,000 out of that just disappears. Your life would change, everything would change. And that's what the world is facing right now. And it's the domino effect.
I agree. I want to get into that, but your Skype started deteriorating, so we're going to reconnect with you, Dan, right now up in Dallas. We're here in Austin, Texas. If you just joined us, this is the Alex Jones Show. And while we're reconnecting with Dan, I'm going to air this clip. CNBC anchor stunned. There is no economic recovery. Investor launches into breathless rant about real financial system. This is one of the chief financial strategists, Rizzuto, a managing director of MIZUHO Securities, which is a pretty big firm. And this is not just him saying this, but John Williams, the list goes on and on. They're all pretty much saying the same thing. Here is that clip.
If you look at the domestic economic conditions, I hear all this discussion about the U.S. economy accelerating. If you look at the GDP number that we're probably going to have in the revised report for the fourth quarter, combine that with the negative report in the first quarter, average growth for all of 2014 is about 2.3%. Fourth quarter over fourth quarter growth will be about 2.2%. That's really where the economy's been growing over the last 5 years. There is no acceleration in underlying economic activity.
All right, that's Steve Rizzuto on CNBC. And then the anchors are stunned. You can watch the full clip. There's a couple more minutes left at Infowars.com and PrisonPlanet.com. You dovetail this attitude with Elizabeth Warren, who's opposing congressional, quote, meddling. Well, Congress controls the power of the purse, so shouldn't they be able to audit the so-called Federal Reserve? What do you say about that, Dan?
Absolutely. The Federal Reserve is it's a one-man show. It's loyal to nobody. Never once, by the way, in the history of the Federal Reserve have they ever said America or Americans are their priority. It's always been the banking system of America or the banking system of the world is their priority. They're not. We don't even exist on their list of priorities.
Well, that's right, and most of the banker bailout money ended up going to foreign banks. I mean, we could have given, in the bailout, $30,000 to every family in America. We would have had inflation, but at least it would have done something for the economy. Instead, it just went into derivatives, which you started getting into the domino effect when your Skype cut out of derivatives if they get triggered. From your research, I know you have a lot of top experts on your show, and you're a pretty smart guy in your own right. How big are the derivatives overhang, and where do you expect the next bubble to pop?
Well, the derivatives overhang, you can't really get an exact number. It's somewhere between 1 quadrillion and 2 quadrillion, and roughly 25 trillion relate to oil, and another 25 trillion relate to the euro. So if Greece pulls out of the EU, that will significantly affect the euro, and it could make $25 trillion of derivatives become worthless, and the other side make it come due. And same problem with oil. So we're right on the cusp of having something that is completely unmanageable, and yet you're hearing these rosy numbers, and it just isn't rosy.
You know, Dan, my grandmother's brother worked at the Dallas Federal Reserve once he got out of the Navy, and we would have debates about the Federal Reserve. But before he died 6-7 years ago, he listened to the show, my Uncle Billy, and he said, Billy Pope was his name. He said, you know, you really are right about this. And a lot of people in the Federal Reserve are upset. So it's not just like the Federal Reserve's been monolithic the whole time. I mean, it was a quasi-private banking group that took over in 1913 with some robber barons. It's had some policies that were for the cabal, not the American people. But I think it's clear now there is a major split in the Federal Reserve with the head of the Dallas and Kansas City Fed becoming very, very critical of the New York Fed. So for folks that don't know the inside baseball, you know some of the folks pretty high level at the Federal Reserve. What are they telling you, and what's really going on? Because, I mean, I looked at the history of the Federal Reserve. I've never seen these unprecedented statements by different Fed branches against the New York Fed.
Well, my friend used to be chief economist for the entire Federal Reserve. He happened to office out of Dallas. When he was with the Federal Reserve, he was this internal optimist. GDP is right, inflation's right, everything's right. And I would talk to him about things like the substitution effect and all those things that are something that he had worked on personally and came up with, which was there to goose the GDP to make Alan Greenspan happy, because Greenspan's philosophy always was that GDP is understated because we're more productive than we are. So the Fed had to come up with a set of metrics that said, oh, we really are more productive, to justify Alan Greenspan's low interest rates and high growth assumptions. When he was with the Federal Reserve, he had one set of opinions. When he left the Federal Reserve, he's still my close friend. He's so much come more my way and your way, and the reality of what's happening out there. And, you know, you're inside looking out, and you toe the company line. But smart guy, and I like him a lot, and especially like him since he's now on our side.
Well, there's the Wall Street Journal. A Fed insider calls for reform. Richard Fisher, president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, believes there's too much power concentrated in the New York Fed. I mean, that's an amazing statement from this year. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, that's today, February 11th. So, I mean, there's a major fissure in the power structure because a lot of these bankers, they like the power to issue unlimited currency and to control that. But when it's done to bring in a world government that's parenthetically against a free society, I think this New World Order has gotten so mature now that people on the inside are being forced to make a choice which side they're going to be on. Can you give us any intel from your sources about how serious the infighting is at the Federal Reserve?
I can't. That I don't get into because a lot of the folks I know inside wouldn't comment. My friends on the outside don't have a good perspective. But keep in mind, people's positions change all the time. Dick Fisher's position changes. Dudley's position changes. They all fit into a story that looks current, and there's some dissension, but the dissension rotates. Sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative. I will say this. When you've talked about this a lot on your show, the key to this world working right this very minute is the strength of the U.S. dollar. Not that I think it should be stronger or weaker, but think about this. The U.S. has a printing press. The U.S. can do whatever it wants to with the world reserve currency. The U.S. has gone to war every time the dollar has been threatened. We can just pick the latest three. We have Iran, Iraq, and Libya. They all threatened to create a gold-backed dinar, a gold-backed currency. Anybody that creates a gold-backed currency is going to pose a threat.
And now the Russians are trying to create their own system based on petrol bricks or something, and so that's why we're starting a war with Russia.
Well, BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It's a coalition of those countries, and now they've added many, many more countries to the coalition. The whole purpose of BRICS was to trade among themselves and not have to use dollars, not have to convert to dollars first. It's very effective, and the number of countries, Canada is involved in this. Mexico's involved in this. As the dollar becomes less important in the world markets, the U.S.'s significance becomes less important. And that's what everybody wants. Everybody around the world wants the U.S. weakened but not dead. They want us to still consume, but they don't want us to be a blockade to their political strategies. They just want us weakened, and I think the currency is the way that they will do it.
Sure, and the globalists are playing both sides. They're heavily invested in BRICS and want to segue into that with a China-centered world system. But China is so fundamentally weak when you look at their real numbers that it just seems like a crazy plan they've cooked up. I don't see it working.
Well, and I've had a lot of close friends in finance that say the same thing. But think about China and Russia together. You know, normally they're mortal enemies. They're not mortal enemies right now. Russia has oil. China has production capacity. They have gold. Admittedly, both those economies are very weak. But truth be told, the United States economy is weak. And we're strapped with $18 trillion worth of debt that Russia doesn't have. So, I mean, everything balances out. But Russia and China have created, through BRICS, they've created their own Federal Reserve System. They've created their own SWIFT system, which is what we use to clear money in essentially in Western world finance. They've created their own system, which is parallel to everything in the West, just so they don't have to be intimidated by the United States.
Sure. I mean, I don't romanticize the Russians and people, but the establishment running the United States and Europe has abused the dollar hegemony and has really done some dangerous things and is forcing the world to try to build a life raft because it's so scary what's happening. I mean, I think that's what's really going on. Briefly looking at this, how can the people running the West devalue the dollar, do all this to other people's currencies, and then get mad at them when they start devaluing their currencies? And then if someone tries to create an alternative system, then they get militarily or economically attacked. I mean, it really is a sinister program of arrogance I see coming out of the West. Do you think it'll go on forever?
Nothing go on forever. But I do agree with what you just said completely. When we call the Chinese currency manipulators, well, what the heck do you call the Federal Reserve? What do you call the U.S. Treasury? What do you call them if they're not currency manipulators? Of course they are. And every country has the right to manipulate their own currency. Every country has the right to change their own trade policies. But the U.S. doesn't like it when it affects the dollar. Any challenge to the dollar will bring out the threats of war. Remember when Obama said he was going to pivot to Southeast Asia? Well, he did pivot to Southeast Asia. because of China and Russia's and the BRICS alliance, you've also got Russia and Ukraine having an issue. One reason the U.S. is in Ukraine is to fight back against Russia. The U.S. can't let Russia and China get a toehold with establishing their own BRICS currency or their own financial systems. That would be such a huge challenge to the dollar. The dollar would be effectively finito.
But this bullying is still forcing them to move forward with that. So it seems almost inevitable. Instead of just trading with Russia, trading with China, like Ron Paul says, and really being the good guys, I think we lose the moral authority playing these games. Dan Kofal, radio host out of Dallas, about to be syndicated via GCNlive.com, is our guest. I've been ranting here. You've got the last 5 minutes. You've got the floor. What do you think about what's happening with the EU, with Greece? I mean, just what's the next big shoe to drop?
Well, the reason that Greece is such a problem is not that it's such a huge economy, but the EU is not designed to have countries come and go from it. The Greeks are really saying, to hell with you, to heck with you about your debt and your austerity. We don't plan to honor the debt. Well, the problem is once Greece says we're not going to honor the debt, then Italy says the same thing. Then Spain says the same thing. And now you have this cascading
effect. Then Portugal, then Ireland.
That's it. And you have this cascading
and the Germans aren't going to sit there and put up with this forever.
No, and the euro, as we know it, will diminish in significance, which is kind of good for the U.S., but that's the reason that the Greeks are so important. And this new Greek government, they call themselves leftists. They look a lot like people from the right years ago, saying we're not going to put up with this forced austerity because it's not in our best interest. Even if the Federal Reserve puts up the money for the Greeks, people will find that out. They'll know, and they can't continue to back Greece forever. So this is a real, no kidding problem that can and probably will cascade through. And the problem is, real quick on the derivatives. The derivatives are so dangerous and so damaging. There's not a nickel behind those derivatives. It's like you going to a crap table in Las Vegas and saying, I want to put $50 on a hard 8, but you don't put any money down. Well, that's what derivatives are like. You're making bets without any equity behind the bets. So
the only equity is the faith and credit of the United States, i.e. the taxpayer.
Well, Steve, you've been right for a long time when it says that the U.S. has now agreed to back $700 billion worth of derivatives. When you first said that, I had to spend some time researching that to figure out where you got that from. And then I saw the introduction of the language in that bill that said that financial institutions can now invest from their banks, which are guaranteed by the FDIC, which means those $700 trillion worth of derivatives are guaranteed by the FDIC and us. You were right on the money, and that's terrifying.
Well, I was just going off what a bunch of financial experts who were reading the bill said, so I was just going off. I could go to the subsection of the bill and see they were doing that. I mean, look at how Obama now wants to take over the education IRAs to protect them and tax them. I mean, if we let them do that, they're going to go after everything. That's the plan.
Absolutely. 401ks, IRAs. It's been in Congress since about 2005 when Democrats first started to make it known that we're not worried about the debt because it's just coincidental that there happens to be just about the same size of the U.S. debt, roughly right now, $19 trillion. There happens to be roughly $20 trillion in 401ks and IRAs. Well, what a wonderful coincidence.
Which is the only place you can keep a little bit of after-tax money and maybe have a retirement. They're going to rob the very baby boomers and people that are putting them in power, while the Democrats constantly claim that it's conservatives that want to loot Social Security when they want to loot the private Social Security.
Well, I'm just shocked that you'd use the phrase rob, because they're not going to rob you, Alex. They're going to take everything you've got, and then they're going to turn right around and give you a piece of paper that says, hold this piece of paper for 30 years. We'll pay you 3% interest, and hopefully you'll get your money back because it's backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. They're going to give you that piece of paper back, even after they've taken all of your assets, all of your hard assets, all of your paper assets. So, you know, I'm trying to be a little humorous there, but yeah, that's exactly what it is. They're robbing America.
Well, Dan, I'd like to invite you down sometime when I'm out of town to co-host with David Knight or some of the other crew, and I really appreciate you being on with us. Thank you so much.